The Impending Flame. Once upon a time, there was a king born a prince into a kingdom of lush greenery, pristine rivers, and noble, hard-working subjects. The king had done nothing noteworthy as prince, and upon receiving the crown, soon after his 30th birthday, did nothing noteworthy until his 40th birthday, but extend the policies that his mother and father had implemented 40 years ago. On his 40th birthday, however, the king's one-eyed soothsayer soothsaid of a minute spark on the opposite side of the world. The soothsayer soothsaid that this spark had already become an ember, and that this ember would soon catch flame, and that this flame would spread so wide and grow so vast as to engulf all of the known lands, culminating 40 years to the day in the destruction of this very kingdom. Heeding the sayings of the soothsayer, the king held a council of the guild masters.
"How can we fend off the impending flame?"
the king asked the guilds. The first to speak was the master of the engineers' guild, volunteering that the subjects might dig a moat deep enough that the flame could not pass. The master had barely completed his utterance before the king decreed that the guilds of the kingdom would immediately begin construction of the great moat. Before the other guild masters could propose alternatives, and before the master of the engineering guild could ask a number of clarifying questions, the king had retreated to his chambers. The king did nothing noteworthy for the next 10 years. The rest of the kingdom, helmed by the Engineers Guild, took to their shovels and began the task of digging the great moat around the kingdom. The soothsayer insisted that holding back the impending flame would require a moat at least 100 feet deep and 100 feet wide. By the king's 50th birthday, half of the moat was completed, 50 feet deep and 100 feet wide. However, the master interrupted the king's celebration with dire news.
"Each and every one of our teams has struck bedrock, my liege. Hard and impenetrable with our current technologies. We're not yet half as deep as we need to be to fend off the impending flame."
Before the master could go on to suggest the ways he thought the team might move forward, which included alternative layouts for the Great Moat and research and development into bedrock demolishing technologies, the king erupted.
"Guild masters! Another plan!"
After a brief, uncomfortable pause, the master of the Masons Guild spoke up, suggesting that a wall of stone could be built high enough that the flame could not pass. The master had barely finished his proposal before the king decreed that the guilds of the kingdom would immediately begin construction on a great wall. Before the master of engineers or anyone else could comment, question, or concern, the rattled king retreated to his chamber. The king did nothing noteworthy for the next 10 years. The rest of the kingdom, helmed by the master of the Masons Guild, took to their tools and began the task of building the Great Wall around the kingdom. The first year or two was spent filling in the ground that had been dug for the Great Moat, packing it in and constructing a suitable foundation for the wall. Afterward, the kingdom began collecting construction-suitable material from nearby deposits. By the king's 60th birthday, the wall of stone surrounding the kingdom had reached 50 feet high. However, the master interrupted the celebrations with dire news.
"We have exhausted all known sources of stone, my liege. The wall is not yet half as tall as it needs to be to fend off the flame."
The king erupted.
"Masters! Another plan!"
The master of the Masons began to propose a number of promising sites to scout for additional building materials, but the king was quick to interject.
"Something that will work! Something new!"
After a careful pause, the master of the Alchemical Guild proposed that a strong enough burst of air might blow the flame out, if enough wind might be captured and harnessed. Before the master could weigh in on the risks of such a plan, or any other masters could object, the king decreed that all resources would be directed toward the construction of turbines for the collection and dispersion of wind. The king did nothing noteworthy for the next 10 years. Nothing but grow notably more frail and reclusive. The rest of the kingdom, helmed by the master of the Alchemical Guild, began the task of amassing wind. The first year or two was spent demolishing the kingdom's incomplete wall, with many of the resources being repurposed toward the construction of giant turbines of refined metals, built upon towers of wood and stone. After their construction, the kingdom began to collect wind in elemental storehouses engineered by the leadership of the Alchemical Guild. For the following few years it looked promising that through the labor and ingenuity of the kingdom they might have the wind required to extinguish the impending flame. However, collection began to slow, and by the king's 70th birthday, there was no more wind to collect. Without wind, the kingdom had become perennially dry and hot. At a sterile and performative celebration, the master approached the king.
"My liege, our stockpiles sit idly at 64.3% of the necessary wind. I'm afraid there is no more wind to collect in the entire kingdom."
Before the master of the Alchemical Guild could propose some additional reservoirs of wind, or the other masters could propose a more efficient way of utilizing the existing storehouses of wind, the king slowly stood up and hobbled to his chambers. On the king's 70th birthday, with 10 years between him and the impending flame, the king doused himself in oil and set himself ablaze.